My name is Mercy, and I'll be your guide today in building a code pipeline in AWS. The services we'll be using will be AWS CodePipeline, CodeBuild, and an Elastic Beanstalk. So in this pipeline, the code pipeline will fetch data from GitHub, and the CodeBuild will build that data based on the script that will be provided. And once that stage is successful, it will trigger deployment to Elastic Beanstalk. So every time there's code changes on our application and a push happens or a commit happens to GitHub, it will trigger the pipeline over and over again. So the code pipeline would fetch the data, code build will build, and the deployment would be done on the Elastic Beanstalk. So what we'll do in this project first is we'll create an Elastic Beanstalk environment, set up a code pipeline, and in that code pipeline we'll use code build on our build phase, and then set the deployment stage to the Elastic Beanstalk environment that we've already created. Okay, enough with the talk. Let's go to our deployment in AWS. On our AWS console, we are going to access this service called Elastic Beanstalk. That's where we are going to start with, and we are going to create our own environment. So the first thing we have to specify is the environment tier, and the environment here is we're going to use a web server. Application, we are going to run an application called URL, and we'll be using a URL shortener application that was built by Samin Mahmood. And the environment part will auto-populate. For the domain, we do not have a domain, but if you have a domain, you can specify. We will be using an auto-generated one. Our platform, we are working on a Django application, so we are going to use Python, and we'll use the recommended versions on Amazon Linux. On the application code, we are going to use the sample application, because what you want to do is you want our code pipeline to push the code into the Elastic Beanstalk later, so we are not uploading any code. On our presets, we are going to use a single instance, which is a spot instance. We will proceed to the next stage. Here it's about the role. One would either create a role or use an existing role. So if you do not have a role for Elastic Beanstalk, you can create by specifying the name, and it will automatically create the role for you. But I have a role, so I'm gonna use an existing role, and so yeah, I can use the service role. My key pair, you need to create a key pair before this, so I'm going to use a URL key pair that I have created. Instance profile, if you do not have one, you need to go to the IAM console and create an instance profile. In my case, I already have an instance profile, so I'm going to use that. We'll proceed to the next. Okay, so for our VPC, you either create your own custom VPC, but in my case, I'm going to use a VPC that already exists in my account. I would like my instances to have a public IP, and I would want it to run on a public subnet, I'm just deploying a front end of an application, so I want it to run on 2 public subnets. I do not have a database, so I won't be involving a database in my configurations. So you can proceed to the next phase. Okay, so for instances, I am going to use a spot instance on a general purpose SSD. The size, you can use HGB, you can change the value. I will just use 12 GB. Monitoring intervals, I would just leave it as a default of 5 minutes, and I'm going to disable this. For the security group, you have to create a security group that you will be using in this project. And I have previously created a security group, and this security group should allow traffic from the internet. That's at port 80. For autoscaling group, you can do single instance or a load balance instance. So with a single instance, you just deal with one, but mostly for production, you would prefer a load balance instances, where the minimum, you will have to specify what is the minimum number of instances. For example, you can say a minimum of 2 and a maximum maybe of 3, and you would have a load balancer to balance the traffic between your instances. My fleet would be on spot instances, capacity optimized, on demand based. What will be the minimum number of on-demand instances with your ESG? You can just go with 1. And the percentage, you can say maybe if the traffic is above 80%, yeah. I'll be using a T2 micro, so I do not really need a T3 small. Also, I will change this to T2 micro. AMI ID, I would leave it by default. For monitoring, I do not really need an enhanced version. I'll be using the basic. I do not have managed updates, so I do not really need to set that. The rest of things, I leave it as default, and I'm using an Nginx server. We can proceed to the next part. Okay, so these are all our configurations for the environment, and we can submit. Okay, this is going to take a little bit of time, maybe 3 to 5 minutes to create, so we can come back once the environment has already been created. Okay, looks like our environment is ready. So what we can see that first thing it has done is it has created a security group for our instances, a bucket to store the logs, an EC2 instance. It has also assigned an EIP to that instance. Okay, so we can check it out and see if it really works. Okay, so our environment has been successfully created, so we can proceed to the code pipeline. Now we would want to build a pipeline, so I'm going to build a custom pipeline, and I'm going to name it as URL code pipeline. I'm not going to use a new role because I do have an existing role, so we can leave the rest as default and proceed to the next. So our source will be the GitHub. So we are going to fetch our code from GitHub. And if you do not have a connection, then you would want to click on this button and to create a connection to your GitHub. So I'm going to use an existing connection. And from my GitHub repo, I can fetch this repository called URL shortener. I'm going to use the main branch. I'm going to leave the rest as the default and proceed to the next stage, which would be the build stage. And I'm not going to use commands. Instead, I'm going to use build provider. And the build provider in this case is our CodeBuild. We are going to use something known as projects. And what a project does is we can create a sample project on our case here. I do have a project, but I can just show you how a project is created. So you have to provide a project name. You can choose either you want a project that is a default project or a runner project. You can choose your environment, whether it's an on demand or a reserved, but I'm going to leave it as on demand, managed image, and an EC2. You can create a new role or an existing role depending on what you have. This part now is where you have to do configurations. If you're going to insert the build commands, you can use here and switch it to editor and then insert all your scripts. But in my case, I'm using the build spec file, which already exists in my repository. And you have to ensure if you are going to use the build spec file, you have to make sure that in the root of your code repository, there has to be a file that is known as a build spec.yaml. And then you can just proceed to the code pipeline. I would like to show you how a build spec file looks like. So a build spec file basically sets an environment. So the runtime would be on a Python, installs all the requirements that we want, and we want to export Django settings module that is equal to the URL Shoshana, which is this folder that has our settings in it. It's settings.py file. Okay, and then we would do a build command where it first collects all the static files, and those are the files that will be accessed by the Elastic Beanstalk after the build. So we can go back to our pipeline and complete. So I'm going to use this project that I had already created, do a single build. We can proceed to the next stage. We will not be doing any tests, so we are going to skip a test stage, but in production, you should really consider using test stage. For the deployment, we will be using Beanstalk. We are deploying it to an environment that we had previously created, and our application name was a URL app, and the environment was the URL app environment. This is the one that is running. So these are pipeline configurations. So we can proceed to create the pipeline. Okay, so as we can see, what the pipeline does is it's currently fetching the data from the GitHub repository. Once the source is successful, it will proceed to the build phase. Good now. So our source has succeeded. So now it's on the build phase. We can view the details of the build phase. And as we can see, it has installed Python 3, created a virtual environment for Python 3. It has installed all the requirements that were mentioned in the requirement.txt. It's exporting the Django settings to equal the URL shortener settings. And then now what it has done is collected the static files, and then what it does is it has proceeded to the post build stage where it's going to collect all the artifacts that will be used by the deployment stage. So our build was successful, so we can go back to the pipeline. We can wait for the deployment. This is going to take about a minute. As deployment has succeeded. So we can go back to Beanstalk and ensure that our environment is in the green state, meaning that it's healthy. So to access our app, we can go to the instances. We can check out on the EC2 instance that was created by the Elastic Beanstalk. Looks like our build is successful again. Now we wait for the deployment stage to be deployed again. As you can see, our pipeline is successful once again, and within a few minutes you can create a full pipeline that will be triggered whenever there is any change, ensuring that there is continuous integration and continuous deployment. Looking forward to building more pipelines with you guys. I will be providing the link to the GitHub repository in the description, so you can try to build your own pipeline too.